Jonathan Jackson. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right, Jay. Thanks for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, man. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I have yet to talk to a healthcare professional, and so there's so many
Hmm.
things that I'm interested um from your perspective on what's going on in the world, what your experiences are in working in
Hmm.
healthcare, and what we as a
Hmm.
community can do to help the amazing work that you're doing. But before we get started, I'd
Okay.
like to just start off with a story. So what story you got for me today?
I mean, I got so many stories. But you know what? There's a story that I like to tell, just because I think at this point in my life, I work as the director of a research center, and so on my day-to-day, people kind of look at me and they sort of think that I've got it all figured out or that I have some kind of grand plan, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. But just thinking back to where it all started. I grew up in rural East Texas. So I lived in a town that has about 300 people in it on a good day, and nobody went to college at all. No one in my family had gone to college. Certainly nobody in my graduating class was really going. So I had to figure it all out on my own. And so I went to, the guidance counselor that we had at my high school, and I said, I want to go to college. I'm hearing about some of these places. I don't know what to do. And his advice was, I'll never forget what he told me. He was like, oh wow. He's like, I wasn't really prepared for this. And he's like, I guess you need to go to the internet and look on the internet for colleges. And that's all I can tell you, because he's just not set up for that. There was nothing, there was no pipeline, there was no guidance, there were no like advanced placement classes where I went to high school.
Mm.
So I had to figure it out on my own, and I did a terrible job. I could not have done a worse job of applying to college. So my math was bad and everything. So I kind of looked around, and somebody had told me. I ended up going to a place called Rice University down in Houston. And the only reason why I picked Rice was because somebody had told me that Rice kids are weird. And I was like, well, I don't need to know what the place looks like. I'm sure that's the place for me. So I looked up online. I saw that they accepted, something called the Common Application. And because I was a lazy, 17-year-old kid, I was like, well, if I can fill it out here, I'm sure I can send this application out to a bunch of other places, and we'll figure it out. I looked at the acceptance rate for Rice, and it said it was 17%. And I was like, well, I'm in the top 17% of my class, so that should be fine. Not understanding how that number worked at all. So I filled out the Common Application at the last minute. Nowadays you can apply to college like early decision, interim decision, regular decision. I was applying regular decision. Last day, 15 minutes before the post office closed, I had my application in hand. I got it in, and I thought I was all set. I thought I was saved. I didn't apply anywhere else. I applied to one school and one school only. And it didn't occur to me that they might say no, because I was a 17-year-old kid. Like, who's going to tell me no?
Right.
And then I found out. So about 3 weeks later, so I sent in the application like January 2nd, 4:45 p.m. I got a letter from Rice in the mail like January 31st. And I was like, wow, they liked me so much that they already told me yes. Like, I thought I had to wait for months to hear back from them.
Mm-hmm.
I open up the letter, and they say, dear Jonathan Jackson, you sent in the wrong application. We don't accept the Texas Common Application. We accept the national regular Common Application. And they're like, you have 2 weeks to send in the right application, or we're gonna have to withdraw your whole application as a whole. So I ended up pulling like 2 all-nighters. I got a regular application, like their regular Common Application in. I had to borrow money from my parents because I didn't have any money to afford another application fee.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first time in my life where I thought I might have screwed something up so badly that there would be these really catastrophic consequences. Um, And fortunately, it worked out. They let me in, and they gave me a like most of a full scholarship, so that because there was no way I could have afforded it otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that story really defines kind of who I am. Like I'm this kid who takes big shots. I'm this kid who doesn't think about all the consequences before I try something. I see something that I think is for me, and I just go for it. And sometimes it works out, and sometimes it blows up in my face. And I think I've had my fair share of both of those in my life. But I still define myself by that first overly naive attempt to break into this rarefied air of 4-year private colleges. And when I got to Rice, it wasn't any better. I messed up a lot. I almost got kicked out because I couldn't afford it on multiple occasions. But I feel like I'm always this kid who's on the outside looking in and just doing his best to fit in. So
Yeah.
that's kind of me.
And how did that do you think that prepared you, like having that mentality or that way of maneuvering the world prepared you to be in spaces where you are the weird kid, you are different, you are like, you know what I mean? Like if you felt like a place like Rice that had weird kids, that was a place for you when you weren't in spaces where weird kids were welcomed. Did that prepare you to sort of be okay in those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of yes and no, but I think looking back, like I've always been the weird kid.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the whitest part of Texas, but I did not present in terms of what they thought a black man should look like. I talked this way. I made good grades. One person told me that because I knew who my father was, I couldn't possibly be black. Like I was not a real black person because my dad wasn't around, but I still knew who he was.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was this really baked in, like awful, really racist idea of what a black person could be. And I never conformed with that, growing up. And I grew up, kind of religious, which most people did in Texas, but instead of being kind of your typical evangelical Christian, I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. So that meant, every time, there was a friend that had a birthday party, or anytime there was like a holiday party at school, like I'm out in the hallway, I can't participate. I'm not allowed to say the Pledge of Allegiance, or in Texas we have a separate pledge for Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't participate in any of that, and people did not get it, and they excluded me, and it was like really upsetting. So it didn't really matter what space I was in. This was true at Rice. It's been true in every place that I've been since then. I'm always the one who's on the outside looking in, and I think that helps me understand the way that systems are constructed and where those systems fail people, because I'm sort of used to having that outsider identity of being the one who is always the square peg trying to get into that round hole. And I think that really informs my work, and it's been especially useful in 2020, as we've been dealing with like these public health crises of racism, these public health crises around coronavirus, and who's going to be included, as we start to build like a new way forward, and thinking about these new models of health that are a lot more inclusive. You really need somebody who understands what it's like to be on the outside, and what it means to be in a space that was never designed for him. So I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but I do think it gives us a really good start into some creative thinking around healthcare.
Yeah, for sure. And so was there a defining moment at Rice or within grad school where you were like, I want to get into the medical field? Like, at what point did you decide that this is a career path you want to go for?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, where I've ended up now is not what I envisioned for myself. So speaking about all these outsider identities, I know a lot of kids who grew up the way that I did. Maybe you can relate to this, Jay, maybe you can't, but there was kind of this rejection of my Black identity that I really had to go through. And so, when you are a kid in East Texas and everybody tells you that you're not really black, and you have like such an awful idea of what it means to be black, what it means to be downtrodden, it means to be dumb, it mean, like the height of your potential contribution is to play football for a couple of years, right? And so, I had convinced myself that I wasn't really black. I was like, I'm a left-handed person because I am lefty, and I was like, that is my sole identity. So, in college, I got a really clear idea of wanting to work on Alzheimer's disease. I was able to study abroad because studying abroad was cheaper than going to my college. Um, and so I had a really great time. I was in New Zealand for about 8 months. And, while I was taking a class there on neurodegeneration, I saw this picture of a brain, a healthy brain next to a brain that's been riddled with Alzheimer's disease. And that was it for me. I've honestly never looked back since. I knew, not for reasons because somebody in my family was affected, but for reasons of what felt like social justice. It seems unfair that you can make it to 70 or 80 years of age and then lose the one thing that's more precious to you than anything else, which is your identity, your memory, knowing that you are loved. Those are the things that we hope that we can have in abundance when we're that age. And to be robbed of that seems like the grossest injustice. So, starting from when I was about 20, I decided that I wanted to focus on Alzheimer's disease. Worked my way through college and through graduate school and through two postdoctoral fellowships until I got to the lab where I wanted to be, which was here in Boston, over at Massachusetts General Hospital. It was my dream lab. I had been trying to get in for years, and I finally did. It was not what I thought it would be. But long story short, I realized that this is a group that was on the very cutting edge of curing Alzheimer's disease. If we announce a therapy for Alzheimer's disease, as we're likely to do, maybe by the end of the year, maybe early next year, it will be because of this group that's at Mass General Hospital, no question. But I realized that not everybody could get in the door when it came to having access to clinical trials, having access to healthcare, and it really started to bother me. And it bothered me so much that I actually quit my job with that group, didn't have a clear plan, and through a combination of basically sheer luck and sort of writing my way out, like something like Alexander Hamilton, I was able to start this research center that is focused on these disparities and inequities in healthcare. And what we're doing is we're really looking at how the system functions and how it was built, and how it was really built to exclude people that look like you and me. In the beginning, it was done for completely racist reasons, and more recently, it's done for reasons that are still racist, but perhaps better intentioned. And so the goal is to kind of leverage that same sense of justice that's kind of guided me my whole life. But instead of applying it specifically to something like Alzheimer's disease, we're doing it for everything. So lately, we spent the summer working on COVID-19, and let me tell you, that's a mess. That's a whole mess.
Yeah.
And I'm just hoping that we can make at least a little bit of a difference before a vaccine goes out the door.
So I definitely want to get into that part, but before we do,
yeah.
So what's actually your role at Mass General? Like, what's this research center? Like, what do you said, you're looking at disparities between, research and different things and trials. So what is actually your role there? Are you a scientist there? Are you just sort of managing it, or kind of what's your role?
Yeah, so I'm the executive director. I'm the founding director of the CARE Research Center. So CARE is an acronym that stands for Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement. So we're a research center that's focused on the science of getting involved, the science of getting involved in research, the science of getting involved and having access to healthcare. It's not just a matter of, do I have the right insurance and can I make an appointment for this time of day? There are a lot of variables and factors that govern what spaces that you can get into, what spaces, once you're into them, you feel comfortable in, and what spaces you're able to stay in over time. So we are in the process of developing an actual quantifiable, prediction-based, theory-based science of all of these efforts. And it turns out that you don't get very far and thinking about, say, access to clinical trials without thinking about access to healthcare. And you don't think about access to healthcare without thinking about like social determinants of health, without thinking about, people who would love to get healthcare, but they don't have the right kind of job. They don't have insurance, or, people who live on the wrong side of town and it would take them, an extra 2 hours to get to a place like Mass General, when there's a place that's maybe, that doesn't have quite as many resources that's just down the street. So, the Care Research Center is really focused on developing that science. We do a lot of research consultations. We do a lot of advocacy work. And of course, we do a ton of community work and community events. We've got a really cool event series coming up at the end of next month about Black health here in Boston that I'm starting to get really excited about.
That's amazing. And so a lot of the conversations, at least of late, have been talking about sort of like allyship, and particularly like, politics, Black Lives Matter movement and such. And so I'm curious as to how you built your staff with an understanding of allyship, simply because of your experience prior to founding this research center. You say, they had good intentions, but there were still some racist issues within that. And so how were you able to build your team? Was it something of like friends that you had in the industry? Like, because this seems to be like, you got to really be wanting to do this kind of work. This you're not doing it for a paycheck, right? This is like,
no, definitely not.
This is hard work. And so how do you build a team with a backdrop of understanding how race, impacts so much of what you do, or the disparities and the politics impact so much of what you do?
Yeah. So, I feel like the Care Research Center is, we're kind of a bunch of misfits, right? So when I wrote the job description, I wrote about this need to be focused on systemic factors rather than individual ones, of understanding what racism looks like in 2020, rather than thinking about what it looked like in 1965, when King and Lewis were marching. So, I wanted to bring in people from inside of Mass General Hospital and from outside of Mass General Hospital who got it, who understood it, from the get-go. And, Mass General is not one of those places that really understands the depth of its own racism and its complicity and perpetuating systemic racism. They're trying, but they still have a long way to go. But there are individuals inside the organization that do get it. And so my first goal when I first started building this research center about 3 years ago was to bring those people together, because I knew that they were like me, that they were stuck wherever they were, that they were struggling, and that it can be draining, it can be despairing, and it could leave you in a position where you might want to leave. So it turns out that working on these issues tends to attract the kinds of people that you would love to work with. And so more recently, we've been able to hire, more nationally. We've been able to do national searches for new personnel. And what's great is we naturally have that diversity that you would expect to see. We don't have a lot of people who are trying to be like white saviors applying for this position. We've actually never had, this is an interesting fact about the Care Research Center. We've never had a white male apply for any position in our center at all. So it's not even like we're turning them away, they're just not applying. Right. And so, what's interesting is that, there seems to be something about the mission of the center that gets past kind of that superficial way of addressing racism that a lot of people are comfortable with, and maybe be starting to understand that they shouldn't be so comfortable with. And it gets to the people who are looking for systemic change. And so because that is like the guiding ethos of the research center, and because, it's a research center that's not, I'm the director, but I'm not the buck doesn't necessarily stop with me. We have a board of trustees, and instead of them being like, like really rich old white dudes, our board of trustees are people who have decades of local experience, community organizing experience in Boston. And they have the final say on how the center functions and operates, what opportunities we take, what opportunities we turn down. And so, we have this fundamental commitment to the community. and ensure that everything we do has some kind of direct community benefit. And honestly, just structuring a place like that, you draw the kind of talent that you want to see. And what's nice is that, for now, there's not a lot of competition. There's no other center in the United States that does what we do. So we have our pick. We can certainly, and we have picked the very best people in the country to do this work. That won't always be the case, and that'll be fine. We'll just raise the bar again and, try to be more competitive. But, it's one of those things that was actually much easier than I thought it would be.
Yeah. Yeah. And so from my understanding and just in our connections, I understand that you're a neuroscientist. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a Black male neuroscientist. For lack of sounding like really superficial, one, like, how does that happen? And then two, how does it happen at MGH where you're able to build an entire research center like focusing on helping, marginalized communities? When you said luck, I'm just like, that's like beyond luck. Like that's like hitting the lottery like 5 times. You know what I mean? Like,
it feels that way. Yeah.
So how has that been an advantage because you are one of very few, or is that a disadvantage because you are one of very few? Or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, so it really is a little bit of both, and part of it is because I really like the idea of you saying that it's like I hit the lottery 5 times. I think another way of putting it is it's like I hit the lottery 5 times, but I didn't know until I sort of cashed all of them in at once to kind of build this research center, right? So it turns out that I was really lucky in going to Rice for my university, because my senior year, they recruited a new neuroscientist professor who had connections to the graduate school that I eventually ended up going to. Mm-hmm. And the graduate school that I ended up going to just happened to be probably the best place in the country to go and do advanced graduate study of neuroscience, especially if you're focused on Alzheimer's disease. I picked it because it was the right fit for me, and because I liked the mentor that I ended up working with. But it's one of the best places in the country. Mm-hmm. And so that set me up for my first postdoctoral fellowship. And then, for my second postdoctoral fellowship, it was just a matter of being relentless. And, I will say that was where I started using my racial identity as a benefit, because as you kind of rise through the ranks, you can just be a neuroscientist, which is something that I was really trying hard to do. Mm-hmm. And then you hit this level where then suddenly you are the Black neuroscientist. Mm-hmm. And it is a blessing and it's a curse, because everybody thinks of you as Black first and then a neuroscientist second. Mm-hmm. So, the white people around you are constantly having you explain race to them, even if it's not something that you study, because I never formally studied race or racism. Mm-hmm. I studied something really boring, like mechanisms of attentional control in white matter. Has nothing to do with race. But what's nice is that because you are speaking to people, other neuroscientists who are not Black about this issue, what I did is you can exploit it, right? You can sort of take advantage of their ignorance around this topic, their unwillingness to engage with this topic, and you can just kind of carve out a little space for yourself. So you can say, all right, I'll be your Black neuroscientist, but you got to give me those resources. You got to give me some of these resources over here. I'll solve your problem. It's going to take, all of this effort and this time, and you guys have to leave me alone for a while. It turns out that you can really build something for yourself while also trying to address, the needs of other people. Mm-hmm. And so over time, you can make that group or that center, like I built, a little bit more insular. So now people within the Care Research Center, they don't have to deal with all of that stuff from MGH. They don't have to deal with, being asked about, what their pronouns mean, or what it means to be a woman in this role or a person of color in that role. I've now kind of built enough resources that we are sort of sequestered off from all of that. But, it really is a combination of having to ride those highs and lows of being, one of the only people that looks like me in this space nationally. So yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I was jokingly saying about the lottery thing because I know there's a lot of hard work, and you have to be gifted, to even be in where you are. And so I'm interested to see, like, when you're out in the community, how is the community embracing you as someone who doesn't typically look like somebody who would actually go out and talk about healthcare to them? Like, how has that been for you or the people on your team? Because Blue Cross Blue Shield or any of these other healthcare institutions, I'm not sure that they have the same sort of mission where they're trying to go directly to the communities specifically that are marginalized. It's more umbrella. And so those who actually are out in the communities it doesn't seem like they look like the folks that are in certain neighborhoods. And so how has that been for you to, like, okay, no, I'm really here to help you. I'm with you in this, and I want to sort of make you aware of these resources that you now have access to. How's that been?
It was something that I had to grow into. I know that I'm not as visible in Black communities as some other folks. But believe it or not, I've given over 500 talks since 2014 to different folks in the Black community. And at first it was this thing that I did because some white people asked me to do it. They needed to have a brown face, for their annual grant reports. They needed something for the website. I'm sure you know what that's like, Jay. Like, I'm on so many websites. It's not because I'm attractive or particularly talented. It's because I'm the only brown face in the room, and those photographers, they just find you. Mm-hmm. And so they needed those photo ops. And it was supposed to be kind of a sort of every so often kind of thing. Like, every few months, we'll kind of let you off your leash, and you can go and sort of speak to the brown and Black communities. Mm-hmm. And it always felt like dessert. Like, this is the fun part that you really get to enjoy, but it can't interfere with those vegetables. It can't interfere with your day-to-day work.
Right.
And then over time, I started to question. I was like, why does this have to be the bonus part? Why can't this be the work? And there was a lot of resistance to that idea in healthcare spaces, where the model is very much like, we are the experts. We will tell you what you need to do and where you need to go and what you need to eat and how you need to think about it. Mm. And that never felt right to me. So I started going out into these spaces more and more and more. And eventually it just, I sort of hit this inflection point where, instead of having to beg for opportunities to go and speak, in a church or in a barbershop or in a community, people were starting to ask me to come and do those things. And that felt really good. Yeah. But I think it was never supposed to be like the plan that, the white folks had for me. But what happened was it just sort of took on this life of its own. And I realized that there was a wealth of wisdom and expertise and data in interacting with the community in this direct way. Mm-hmm. And so, I was like, this is what should energize and support and guide, our health research. It needs to come from the community. Otherwise, we're just guessing in terms of what's going to work and what's going to be of benefit. So, I pushed for that, and I was able to get some policy papers written, and that kind of translated into some support at Mass General to do this work. And I mean, to date, we're the only group at Mass General that's focused on equitable access to research. Mm-hmm. Mass General has 27,000 employees. Mass General Brigham has got 77. And it's just this little group of 10, 11 of us trying to solve this, this huge institutional problem. Yeah. It's bigger than us. But at the same time, it's really, really fun and gratifying work, because you can really see the impact that you're having. And I love, that we are directly accountable to local marginalized, underserved communities. Mm-hmm. Where if we're not doing something, they'll let us know. Right. And if what we're doing is not working, they'll let us know. And that is really rewarding and honestly pretty humbling.
and so could you tell me a little bit about sort of some of the things that you were working on, or some of the issues that were bubbling up in these communities that were sort of under the radar from a healthcare perspective, and then leading up to COVID? Because COVID is at the top of everyone's consciousness now, right? But there was probably, you talked about Alzheimer's. What are some other issues that were happening in these communities where you were talking to these individuals and they was like, yeah, Jonathan, my mom is dealing with this, or my grandfather's dealing with this, and so on and so forth. Like, what were some of the things that bubbled up for you?
Yeah, so I mean, my perspective is going to come from the role of somebody who's been a neuroscientist for a while. And so, the first thing that I went to talk to these communities about was about Alzheimer's disease, and saying, this is something that is in your community. Most people don't know that Black folks get Alzheimer's at a rate at least twice as often as white people. It's just not one of those facts that's out there that's well understood or appreciated. And that's because in our community, folks that look like us, we don't get diagnosed, we don't get treated. And even if those things do happen, we don't call it Alzheimer's disease. We come up with a bunch of other creative terms to kind of call this, this process of kind of losing our memory and losing our identity. And so it was just a matter of trying to help folks understand, that this is not something that is around the corner. This is not something that is going to head your community by 2025. It's already here, and we need to recognize it and look for different kind of treatment methods. So, I think what was exciting was the opportunity to share this new information. And once I noticed that once I started sharing, people were so hungry for more information. They always, I always got invited back. People always wanted to know a little bit more about what was going on. And then eventually people wanted to know, what is, how are we going to cure this thing? What does that process look like? And that's how we started talking about clinical trials. And so clinical trials is the dirtiest of dirty words. If you mention clinical trials to somebody who's not a clinical trialist, you get a shudder. People don't like talking about it. It sounds bad. People think of, the Tuskegee syphilis study. And so, we had to navigate all of that. So I started writing talks that said, let's just outline, let's go through and hit the list of, the top 15 major medical abuses against Black people since the 1850s. And, I give the talk, and I actually still give this talk to this day with some frequency, that just outlines them. So I say, it's not just Tuskegee, it's not just Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks. Here are like 10 other things that were even worse that happened. And what's nice is that acknowledgement coming from somebody who has this kind of healthcare standing was something that these communities had never heard before. And what was nice is that, it meant that I had to be vulnerable, and it meant that they were willing to work with me because they saw that vulnerability. And so what was nice is that we then started talking about what clinical trials were and why they didn't work. And so from my perspective on the healthcare side, everybody thinks that Black people don't take part in clinical trials because they don't trust anybody. There's mistrust because of Tuskegee. And yeah, that's part of it, but that is not the whole thing. There's modern day, current era racism happening every single day in these health establishments that's not well understood. So, what was great about fostering these conversations was, these community professionals, these clinical researchers were coming into community spaces and realizing, this is what racism looks like. Oh, they're realizing for the first time, it's not just, Tuskegee, there's stuff going on that we have to address. And so what that does is it kind of sets the stage for conversations about how clinical trials work for Alzheimer's disease. But then also I started getting involved in work for cancer. And then I started doing work for diabetes clinical trials. Then I started doing precision medicine. And so, because I've been active in all of these spaces and realizing, there's some stuff that's specific, and then there's some stuff when it comes to accessing clinical trials and thinking about therapies and thinking about health disparities, that are really universal truths. When COVID started happening around the United States, I think it wasn't until mid-April that we kind of collectively understood that it was affecting some populations more than others. But for those of us who had been studying health disparities for a long time, we were just waiting for that news. And it was worse than I had imagined, worse than I could have anticipated. But we all knew that there was going to be, a certain disparity for brown and black folks. And so, I think the last 5 months has been just a real scramble. The medical enterprise has never moved this quickly for anything in our history. And when you move quickly, you lean on your old habits. You kind of lean on these reflexes that you have. And the reflex of the research establishment right now is to exclude brown and black people. Not for the reasons that you'd think, but that exclusion is happening nonetheless. So, what we've been doing at the Care Research Center is getting on everybody's radar. We've been getting real loud, real angry. We've been meeting with medical schools around the country. We have talked to industry. We've been talking to the companies that are making these drugs. We've been talking to the researchers that are leading these clinical trials, and pushing for some way of creating more accountability and more support to have people of color involved in the process. And one of the problems is that people think, if we want to get brown and black people involved in clinical trials, the only way that they can be involved is if they are research subjects, if they take part in the clinical trial as participants. But that's not true. You can have people of color that are involved on the study team. You can bring them in to be research ambassadors. You could have them review the protocols, for ethics violations. The truth is we need brown folks, we need black folks, we need community folks at all of these stages. And I think that that's still just not at all understood in the healthcare establishment. And so, we have this ongoing problem that COVID has really made much worse. And so, I don't know if we're going to be able to fix it in time for a vaccine to come out. But, I can say that we're doing our best. And it's hard because everybody's moving, 10, 20, 30 times faster than we normally do. And so there's just a lot less space to have these conversations in a way that's meaningful to the people who have kind of the money and the power and the influence.
Yeah. And so you mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of reasons, but not reasons that you would think. What are what is like maybe one reason that we could sort of connect to have a better understanding what that means?
Yeah. So when we talk about clinical research, if you think about, if I were to ask you, Jay, and I'm going to flip just one question at you, and I promise I won't do this anymore. If you thought about like a clinical research subject, what kind of person do you tend to think about? Like what does that person think of? Is that somebody?
A rich white person to me.
Yeah, a rich white person. And so I think that is something that is not well understood. So the only people that are doing clinical trials, are rich white people. The point of fact, it's not just rich white people, it's rich white men who have, doctoral degrees, who are living in an urban city along the east or west coast of the United States. And that is what clinical trials look like globally, across the entire world. We give these clinical trials to the ultra wealthy and the ultra privileged, and then, only then, if it works for those folks, we then say, all right, we'll give it to everybody else. The problem is, that rich white folks aren't built like the rest of us. And even if they were, they have resources that, that the rest of us simply don't have. When we talk about, a possible COVID-19 vaccine, you don't necessarily think, for some reason, those, a lot of us don't think that it's still those rich white people that are getting those vaccines in the research studies, but it is. And so what that means, and what we have learned the hard way, is that if you test a drug on rich white people, it benefits rich white people. And so there's all this discussion in the healthcare industry about, disparities in care, like maternal mortality rate. So we know that Black women are like 4.5 times more likely to have complications or to die during childbirth than white women. And the reason why is because of clinical trials. It's because, starting in the late 1970s, after Tuskegee, as a direct response to Tuskegee, we said, we don't want to do research studies like this. We don't want to make Black people or poor people or or people in prisons are guinea pigs anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to go with the people who are already connected to our system. That was rich white people. And so almost immediately, the maternal mortality rate dropped for white women, for rich white women.
Mm-hmm.
It went way, way, way down, and it stayed relatively steady for Black women until like the last 5 or 6 years, when it has started to go up. And the reason why it's going up is because we are building and reinforcing a system that is really designed for rich white people. And that includes, and it especially includes, clinical trials. I think there's a lot of fear and concern around a COVID-19 vaccine, but it's really just business as usual for something like that. And part of the reason is not just because people have dark skin. It's because we design research studies that are completely inaccessible unless you have a ton of money and a ton of time on your hands.
Yeah.
If you are a person working a regular job, if you are a person who has someone little at home, or someone who maybe isn't so little but still needs a lot of help, you can't participate. If you have any comorbidities, so if you have, let's say, diabetes and hypertension, then you can't participate in most clinical trials. And so it turns out that a lot of things that Black people have sort of conveniently mean that we are excluded from research studies. So, we got to change the system to be designed for, the people who need the most help, because the way that it is right now, you think that you are not getting involved in a clinical trial. But the truth is that after a study is approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, they do something called long-term monitoring, which is basically a nationwide clinical trial to see how the drug works in a bunch of people who are taking it. And if we don't have Black folks and brown folks involved before it's approved by the FDA, we only find out whether the drug works or not in us when we're paying to take it. So that becomes the clinical trial. We become, people are worried about being experimented on. It is not going to happen without your knowledge. In the vast majority of cases, it's going to happen when your doctor prescribes you a drug and we don't know how it works on someone who looks like you. And so that's the reality of healthcare right now. And that is the reason, or at least a major reason, why we have these huge racial disparities, because these drugs don't work on Black people because Black people have been excluded.
And that's one of the issues why you're doing this work, period. Is just like,
it's exactly why I'm doing this work. Yeah. Like there's no reason for this kind of disparity. Like there's nothing about my brown skin that would suggest that a medicine should not work as well in me.
Yeah.
And so but the thing is, there's no science around that. There's no infrastructure. There's no statistics around that. So the Care Research Center is saying, you know what, we're tired of just pushing for these things and having our stories be all you hear. So let's put the math behind it. Let's put the science behind it, and build some real structures of accountability here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. I want to sort of pull back just a little bit. Earlier,
Sure.
You mentioned, the way you've been sort of brought up into the world. You kind of look at things from the outside looking in, and you're really, can identify systems and how they work. Now, me and you last year worked, we were, sort of classmates in Lee Boston, and in Lee Boston has a lot of different representatives from different industries. I'm interested to know, going through that program, were there things that informed your work in working with these other folks from other, education, law enforcement, all these other aspects, systems, right? How did that, or did it inform any of the work that you're doing today? Because I know for a fact that I learned so much from you just in our talks and, your comments in class. I'm wondering, because of your, sort of like aptitude for understanding systems, was that helpful in the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I would say in a couple of big ways and a couple of small ways. It was interesting to see that something that was so visible to me was completely invisible to other folks. So, in Lead Boston, part of the program requires us to interact with these different sectors of Boston. So we talked about transportation, we talked about education, we talked about kind of the, police and the carceral system. And, what's interesting is that, we all kind of knew going into it that the carceral system is rough for people of color.
Right.
We know that educational outcomes are different for people of color. But when we started talking about my sector, healthcare, I thought it was going to be the same. I thought it was going to be the same as like, well, we all know that the system is crooked. We all know that the system, doesn't serve people who look like this. There was a little bit of that. But I think that I was surprised to see that people really thought that the healthcare sector would be different than these other sectors, and it just isn't. We like to think that it is. We like to think that because we have all these fancy degrees that we're sort of above all of it, and we're not. We're just as susceptible, if not more so.
Yeah.
So I think that was the first part that was very surprising to me. The second part, and I think what makes Lead Boston really work well, is recognizing that solutions have to be multi-sector. Like if you're going to try to improve educational outcomes, you got to think about health. You got to think about the carceral system. You got to think about transportation. Like you can't just focus on education. Similarly, what I think I appreciated with much more clarity is if you're going to focus on healthcare outcomes, you can't just think about health. Like you can't just think about like, if I get a vegetable into the hands of every kid, we'll be fine. You have to think about how these systems, cross these vast sectors. You think about redlining and banking. You think about, housing and you think about, how educational systems are based upon property values. And if you are living in the right area of town, then of course you have access to good education. Of course you have access to a good store with fresh fruits and vegetables that are somewhat affordable. Without all those things, you're not going to have health, but you're not going to be able to fix health without thinking about, these broader stakeholder values. The other thing that I really thought was interesting about Lead Boston was actually led by you, Jay. And this is not something that I've said very often, but it's something that I've really deeply internalized. I've kind of dedicated my career to being, a scientist and sort of recognizing that if you provide facts and if you provide enough facts, that control for a variety of contexts, that, you can really reach people and help people understand what it is they're doing. And, in starting the Care Research Center, that's not true. Like you can, and I think we all have learned this as a society, you can throw facts at people day after day, and they're still going to reject the reality that they live in. But what was really phenomenal was kind of seeing how you in particular, in going through Lead Boston, how you were able to really connect and reach people that, frankly, I thought were beyond reach, in the program. So, because Lead Boston is Lead Boston, you get a wide variety of individuals, and everybody's kind of on a different path and a different journey to recognizing their own racist tendencies, their own internalized racism, their own anti-racist or lack thereof efforts. And I noticed that, I was able to kind of sometimes get people to think or to talk by tracking, for example, like how often women versus men were speaking during a meeting at Lead Boston. But I noticed that whenever you talked, you were able to reach everyone, like no matter where they were in their journey. Your words were so powerful and they were so resonant. And what that helped me appreciate, that I think scientists like me don't often appreciate, is that there has to be a qualitative, there has to be a narrative, there has to be a storytelling, there has to be an artistic aspect to this. And I don't want to, I don't want anyone to think for a moment that as a scientist, I somehow reject art, because if you are any kind of good scientist, you are as artistic as you are precise every day of the week. So, it wasn't that I didn't appreciate those things, but seeing how your kind of narrative-driven perspective got people to understand things that no other, we were in these classes with these lectures, with these, world-renowned speakers, but you kind of humbly coming in and sharing your stories was so powerful that I've actually spent the last few months at the Care Research Center looking for a qualitative researcher to come and join our group. And actually I found one. She's going to be starting on September 1st.
Oh.
But that was entirely informed by just seeing how incredibly effective you are in these spaces. So, I think progress in this space does not have to be so iterative. It doesn't have to be so small or so zoomed in that you sort of lose perspective. You can be, someone like you. You can be like a Jay Williams who comes in and sort of has this powerful way of speaking that can kind of get people to stop and take stock. And then finally, they'll be like, that's what these statistics mean. That's what the storytelling means. That's what this feeling of discomfort is that's in my chest that I haven't wanted to acknowledge. I think that was probably the single most powerful lesson that I learned in Lead Boston is that you got to mix the qualitative with the quantitative.
Yeah.
Any one version of telling these narratives and telling these stories is not going to be enough. But if you can blend it and serve that up to people, then you really have a good shot at making a difference. So, I never told you this, but I've never thanked you for this. So I want to say thank you because that was, that was something that I have been really thinking about for over a year now. And, it was incredible to watch.
Thank you. That that was a surprise to me, but I'm really humbled by that, and I'm glad that I was able to contribute to sort of your learning and understanding, and now that that understanding has led you to connect with another researcher that's actually going to help push that work. Like that's amazing. And so I guess my last question to you is, what can we do to help? Like what can our community do to help you do the work that you're doing in our communities? What are some action steps that we can take?
Yeah, I would say that demand attention. If there's one thing that I could use the community's help on, one thing that I think maybe the community doesn't understand is how powerful your voice is at this moment. I can present data, I can show studies, I can get grants, I can tell my own individual stories, but because I'm internal to the system, it is easy for the system to ignore me. If the community could step in and step up and talk about the reasons why they don't interact with the healthcare system, the reasons why they don't interact with clinical trials, whether it is trust, whether it is money, whether it is time, whether it is awareness, all of that is extremely helpful and relevant information. So, I think that we're in a space where, I would encourage people who are, especially if you're skeptical of the healthcare system, don't be skeptical in such a way that you avoid the system. Be skeptical in such a way that you interrogate the system. Demand better. In terms of something very concrete, after Tuskegee in America and pretty much everywhere else, we created something called institutional review boards. So every institution that does any kind of research that affects people, it has to be reviewed by this local ethics board. Within those this is federally mandated. You can't do human subjects research without it. Every ethics board, every IRB needs to have community representation, and most of them just don't, because people don't know what this opportunity is. So I've been working really close with folks at Mass General Hospital and Mass General Brigham, which used to be called Partners Healthcare. And we are looking for 50 community members to join the IRB at Partners at Mass General Brigham. So, if there's any way that we can kind of put like my contact information in the show notes or information about the IRB, that's a concrete way, because, without your say-so as a community member on an IRB, research doesn't happen. You get absolute control over saying yes or no to research. And if it's research that doesn't work for your community, it's not ethical, you feel that people aren't being paid enough or told enough, you get to demand more. And researchers have to listen to you. They can't do their study without your permission.
Yeah.
So, I think that this is the first concrete way to build a system that's accountable. And we need as much of the community that is willing to jump into this space as possible, because this is how we change the system.
So I will definitely provide a link, in the description to not only you, the Care Research Center, as well as the IRB information, so folks could, participate. And then also, is there places that they can support financially? They don't have the time necessarily to, to be, to help with the IRB. Is there places where they can help support financially for specific communities? How does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, people are welcome to support care if they want. We won't say no to that support, but right now, this summer we are supporting a local nonprofit to Boston, which is Families as Justice for Healing. And so if people would be willing to donate to that organization, so the Care Research Center opened things up. We did a $1,000 donation to the organization. We've challenged all of our colleagues around the country to do the same. If folks listening to your podcast want to support, so this is not a research group. They don't do clinical research. This is an organization that, mostly built by women of color to support, women or people who are justice involved. Either they have been involved with the justice system or they have a loved one that's involved with the justice system. And we know that this is a group that has no support. This is a group that has been completely devastated by COVID-19. So Families as Justice for Healing, if you don't have time to get involved in an IRB or to really think about this stuff, please go out and support that group. They are a fantastic organization, and they could really use the attention.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much for your wisdom today, your experience, your knowledge, all of that. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I learned so much, and thank you for your kind words and your time, man. I really appreciate you. I really do. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I feel like I owe you. I definitely owe you one for everything that you taught me last year. So thank you, Jay, and happy to pay it back. Happy to come back anytime. If people have any questions, you can direct them my way. But I'm actually just glad that I got a chance to say thank you for being part of Lead Boston last year. It's great timing, and I think it will definitely change the way that I do my work.
Definitely, man. And before I go, I just want to let you know, because we don't hear it enough, especially from each other, that I love you, man. I see you, and your work matters. Your work matters. And please continue to keep pushing. Please do. We need you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jay.
All right, man. You take care.
All right.